countries, they need us to act with unity of purpose, the purpose being to alleviate their suffering. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President, Secretary General. Colleagues, as a member of the Security Council, I am very sorry that we were unable, in the case of the conflict in Ukraine, to carry out the responsibility to maintain international peace and security. In the meantime, we must here in the General Assembly make our stand clear. That stand, according to Kenya, is to affirm the sovereign equality of Ukraine, to recognize the right of Ukraine to its political independence and territorial integrity, not being forcefully violated by the Russian Federation. We have spoken repeatedly on how important it is that we stand united in defense of the United Nations Charter on this occasion, and so we will not belabor the point again this afternoon. There are further considerations we would like to bring to your attention that may strengthen our collective response. Mr. President, yesterday afternoon, the permanent representative of the Russian Federation spoke of his delegation's veto on the 25th of February. He described it as, and I quote him, a tool for ensuring the balance of interests, which the world needs so badly, and ensuring global stability through this balance. End of quote. He recalled that the United Nations was created following a great war to avoid its repeat. And as he put it, and I quote him, the world's powers consented to make agreements, ideally find consensus, but in any case, never attempt imposing their decisions upon each other or to try to ignore the interests of any of the P5 members, close quote. Seeing the world from the lens of 1945, I believe that he is at least partially correct. And he is also right to argue that the world badly needs a balance of interests. But we strongly disagree that interests belong solely to the world's powers, or that we must live today with the benefit of this United Nations as Thucydides described when he stated that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. It is time that this General Assembly took seriously the challenge of security sector reform, or rather Security Council reform, We can only wonder what a reformed Security Council would have achieved for the people of Ukraine. We urge delegations to insert fresh urgency to negotiations on reform. And in line with Africa's Ezulwini consensus, to improve on the balance of competence between the General Assembly and the Security Council.
Members, let us be clear, this is not only a security crisis, this is a humanitarian crisis. This war of choice is not only a violation of international code, it violates the conscience of the world. Security assistance is needed, but it alone is not enough. We call on the international organizations to provide us with humanitarian assistance. We call on you to register all cases in which international law and international humanitarian law are violated. Almost all speakers and briefers today were unanimous in their assessments. The situation in Ukraine could deteriorate sharply. Let me provide you with the latest available information from the government of Ukraine. Today is the 5th day of a full-scale, unprovoked, and unjustified war launched by Russia against Ukraine. Launched by Russia against the very heart of Europe. Launched by Russia against the idea and ideals of democracy. It is the most horrible and large-scale invasion since World War II. In the morning, I told the General Assembly about the shellings of the residential city of Kharkiv by Russian Grads, killing and wounding dozens of innocent civilians. Now the residents of Kiev, the home of 3 million innocent people, and its suburbs are sitting within Russian crosshairs right now. According to Ukrainian Health Minister Viktor Lyashko, as of today, over 352 people, including 16 children, were killed, and about 2,040 people, including 45 children, wounded. Russia keeps attacking kindergartens and orphanages. Russia is attacking hospitals. Russia is attacking mobile medical aid brigades with shellfire and sabotage groups. Russia fired an ambulance cruise near Zaporizhzhia and Kiev. Let me say that again so that you can see this image in your mind. Russia is attacking hospitals, mobile aid brigades, and ambulances. This is not the action of a state with a legitimate security concern. This is the action of a state determined to kill civilians. There is no debate. These are war crimes. These attacks violate the Rome Statute, and these attacks are far from over. That is why I say this is a humanitarian crisis. As we sit here, Russian missiles are aimed at destroying critical infrastructure, which could lead to a serious environmental disaster and even radioactive contamination. International humanitarian law is crystal clear. None of these facilities are legitimate military targets. The civilian population of Ukraine is the first to suffer from such attacks, and if we do not act today, it will be far from the last. We welcome the statement issued today by the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan on the situation in Ukraine, the statement about his decision to proceed with opening an investigation. In his statement, the ICC prosecutor says that he reviewed the office's conclusions arising from the preliminary examination of the situation in Ukraine and has confirmed that there is a reasonable basis to proceed with opening an investigation. In particular, he is satisfied that there is a reasonable basis to believe that both alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed in Ukraine in relation to the events already assessed during the preliminary examination by the office. Given the expansion of the conflict in recent days, it is his intention that this investigation will also encompass any new alleged crimes falling within the jurisdiction of his office that are committed by any party to the conflict on any part of the territory of Ukraine. The prosecutor will also be asking for the support of all state parties and the international community as a whole, as his office sets about its investigation. He will be calling for additional budgetary support for voluntary contributions to support all his situations and for the loan of gratis personnel. The importance and urgency of the prosecutor's mission is too serious to be held hostage to lack of means. End of quote. To my colleagues from around the world, this affects you too. Russian military aggression kills not only Ukrainians, but threatens thousands of foreigners who are staying in Ukraine. The Ukrainian government is doing its best to facilitate their passage at the state border, even as the border has become overwhelmed with the massive influx of people fleeing Russia's armed aggression. Temporary volunteer assistance points have been set up at the border to provide foreign students with food and cater for other humanitarian needs. Please do not be misled by Russian disinformation. There is no discrimination based on race or nationality, and if there are cases, they should be investigated. Journalists working in the free press also are under fire during live reports from the scenes of action and hot spots. A journalist and a photographer working for the Danish newspaper, Extra Bladet, were injured when their car was targeted in Akhtirka district of Sumy region. Ukrainian children are crossing the EU-Ukraine border without their parents and without powers of attorney from their parents. In this regard, we request decision makers in the EU countries to provide clarifications and instructions to EU institutions in order to secure free movement of and assistance to such underage persons and their guardians. According to the Ministry of Education of Ukraine, more than 350,000 school children have no access to education. Schools are closed due to severe insecurity in civil areas across the country. The numbers of refugees are being assessed. The numbers could be hundreds of thousands of people who have been forced to flee across international borders into neighboring European countries, mostly Poland, Slovakia, and Romania. It can take several days of waiting to cross the border, and we are grateful that more checkpoints on the border with Poland have been opened, including 2 additional pedestrian crossings for all who want to get from Ukraine to the neighboring safe country. Kyiv local authorities have set up a coordinating humanitarian headquarters to provide food and basic necessities to those in need. An electronic platform will be launched tomorrow. On this platform, businesses will be able to provide information about their available resources, and Kyiv residents will be able to announce their needs. All of this information will be systematized for effective communication and distribution of essential goods. Olga Stefanishina, the Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, who has been appointed as a government coordinator for humanitarian assistance, working 24/7. There are many urgent things to do, like to agree on humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilians from the most endangered territories. However, I need to warn you not to be misled by Russian assurances of security. Russian words often, if not always, do not match their deeds. For instance, just recently we heard Russian politicians and diplomats, even here in this chamber, who said that there would be no invasion, no attacks on Ukraine. Hence, these corridors can be easy targets to the Russian army. To help people at the border, crossing points in western regions of Ukraine who are waiting for crossing for at least 1 to 2 days. To provide assistance to IDPs in western regions of Ukraine, including housing, schools, jobs. To provide humanitarian aid to civilians who remain home and now are cut off from markets, including in the occupied territories. Distinguished members of the Security Council, this is not only a security crisis, this is a humanitarian crisis, as I said before. The Russian war against Ukraine has brought the entire region to the brink of humanitarian catastrophe. Let me therefore repeat our call to the international organizations to provide all possible humanitarian assistance and to register all cases in which international law and international humanitarian law are violated. You have all heard the lies from the Russian side, lies in Moscow, lies in the General Assembly, and lies in the Security Council. Distinguished members of the Security Council and friends around the world, do not listen to Russian lies. Listen to Ukraine's cries. Listen to the cries of men, women, and children who have lived in peace, who deserve to remain in peace, who will forever support your own nation's efforts for peace across Europe and around the world. Russia has tried and failed to defend its lies, but the people of Ukraine, with the help of the world, will never fail to defend our land. Do not listen to Russia's lies. Listen to Ukrainian cries. We need your help. The Russian ambassador laments that a dozen of Russian spies won't be able anymore to enjoy all the benefits of American life while doing things incompatible with their status used as a cover-up. The Russian ambassador should instead work hard to report to his superiors that only his cronies, a bunch of cronies, buy his narrative here in the United Nations. I want to conclude with saying that I'm looking forward to midnight, even though the midnight is the most dangerous time right now because that's when the most of the attacks take place. But I'm looking forward to midnight when this abomination, occupation of the seat of the President of the Council, will be over. I thank you.
I would like to now give the floor to Martin Griffiths and Filippo Grandi and ask them to answer the question that we put when we made the statement about the placement of heavy weaponry in residential areas in Ukrainian towns, and how is this in line with international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me respond to that, if I may. I'll try to. I can say that we have no confirmation of such reports of radicals placing such weaponry in residential areas. The fact is that accountability at this stage for breaches of international humanitarian law, which we must see in time, is naturally at this level of the conflict and this level of the violence, at this level of the uncertainty, very difficult to establish. We are truly in a period of a fog of war, a fog which obscures the futures of so many people of Ukraine. I made a number of points, I would add, in my remarks, in my briefing, about our fears of the impact on civilian objects, civilian infrastructure, as a result of urban warfare. I mentioned, for example, Mr. President, our reminder that large-scale urban warfare also requires the need to avoid the wide-area explosive weapons. We are very, very concerned at what we're seeing now in the streets of some of the key large modern cities of Ukraine, the way in which people are voting with their feet, the way in which basic services are being interrupted, and the way in which civilian infrastructure is being damaged. And we will, in time, I am quite sure, discover who did what and who broke which requirements of international humanitarian law. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, I wanted to ask Filippo Grandi, do you want to take the floor?
No, thank you, Mr. President. I fully support what the Undersecretary General just said. Thank you.
There are no more names described on the list of speakers, but before adjourning the meeting, I would like to say that whilst listen to our briefers, I was surprised because just the reports and videos and information in Ukraine, some of them are taken as fact, and others, which are obvious, the ones that we have in the internet are fully reliable, unquestionably reliable, are being considered inaccurate, unreliable, are considered not to be verified, well, we're going to have drawn lessons from that, and we expect that the UN leadership will tell us how the Ukrainian activities are to be considered. There are no more names inscribed, as I said, but before adjourning the meeting, as this is the last scheduled meeting of the Council for the month of February, I would like to express a sincere appreciation of the delegation of the Russian Federation to the members of the Council and the Secretariat for all the support that they've given to us. It was a busy month. We managed to get to consensus on several important issues within our purview, although, as you know, not on everyone. I would like to once again thank all the representatives of the Secretariat, including the conference services, interpreters and translators, verbatim reporters, and security staff. Our presidency is coming to an end, and I know I speak on behalf of the Council in wishing the delegation of the United Arab Emirates good luck in the month of March. The meeting is adjourned.
A peaceful solution to this conflict. Mr. President, we are aware that the current situation is the result of several factors that have played out over time, and we understand that there are legitimate security concerns on the part of those involved that must be heard and managed as best as possible, and this in order to avoid a more serious crisis in the region. We can't simply guarantee the security of some states to the detriment of the security of others. The international community has to be capable of building collective security. With that in mind, we appeal to all to avoid declarations or actions such as unilateral sanctions, which, instead of promoting dialogue, undermine any possibility of a peaceful solution. We believe that all relevant stakeholders must focus their efforts on ensuring an immediate cessation of hostilities, on protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure, and we call for the safe and unfettered access to humanitarian assistance to be allowed when required. Finally, we underscore the efforts undertaken by the Secretary-General to ensure that this situation does not further escalate, and we agree that what's happened so far is not irreversible action. We must not and we cannot throw in the towel in the face of weapons. The respect for life must prevail. The respect for international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter must guide us towards achieving a lasting and sustainable peace in the region. Many thanks, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of plurinational state of Bolivia. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, yesterday, the Russian president ordered his country's nuclear weapons to be put onto combat readiness. This was a clear escalation of a crisis that he himself initiated by launching an illegal invasion against a neighboring state. This unnecessary action, once again, brings to us the specter of the use of nuclear weapons. This threat of the use of nuclear weapons is a violation of the UN Charter. It is also a violation of the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But beyond violating international law and beyond the absolute failure of so-called nuclear deterrence are the lives of millions of innocent civilians that are being directly threatened by this atrocious, abhorrent strategy. We are returning to the idea of mutually assured destruction and to the prospect of a devastating global catastrophe. In Ukraine, Russian forces have already caused grave violations of international humanitarian law and perpetrated grave violations of international human rights law. They have used explosive weapons in populated areas. They have bombed residential areas, schools, and a hospital. They have used cluster munitions, which are prohibited under international law. Civilians are being killed and injured. Civilian infrastructure is being destroyed. Thousands of civilians are fleeing on foot, seeking humanitarian assistance and shelter in subway stations. Cyber attacks have also been part of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. These have included the targeting of civilian infrastructure and the disruption of civilian life. We are seeing ongoing human rights violations and abuses in certain areas of the Donetsk, Luhansk areas and the Crimean Peninsula. These violations have included extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, abductions, politically motivated prosecutions, discrimination, harassment, intimidation, violence, including sexual violence. There have been arbitrary detentions and arrests.
In defense of the Charter and saving this organization for the future generations.
Can you tell us a bit more about the text messages you read at the General Assembly? How did you obtain them?
What text?
The screenshots.
Oh, you can go to the authorities of Ukraine and you ask them. They are verified by the authorities.
Ambassador, what did you find out from the talk, from the peace talk, from your government? What's really happening?
No, I have no comments because they will continue tomorrow. Too early to comment. Too early to comment. I have no readout for security reasons. All right?
Thank you, Mr.
So see you soon.
Yeah.
Do you expect your foreign minister coming back to New York?
Nuclear forces be taken off alert. And Costa Rica, once again, calls upon nuclear weapon states to comply with their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Their obligations to pursue nuclear disarmament in good faith, and moreover, we urge all states to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which bans the development, possession, the threat of use and use of nuclear weapons. It also contains a framework for verifiable nuclear disarmament. Costa Rica urges humanitarian access. This access must be unimpeded, and we ask the President of the UN General Assembly to appoint a special envoy to act as the body's representative on humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees, and this in support of the work that UN agencies are already undertaking. This Assembly, Costa Rica hopes to see, the safe evacuation of all those fleeing the conflict, including foreign nationals, workers, and students. Costa Rica condemns in the strongest possible terms the violations and abuses of international humanitarian law and human rights violations and abuses resulting from Russia's military invasion of Ukraine, and we call upon the Russian Federation to end these abuses immediately, and we call upon them to protect civilians and to stringently observe international human rights law and international humanitarian law. All members of the General Assembly must condemn the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and we must also support the ongoing diplomatic process seeking to achieve a diplomatic solution to this issue. We urge all states, all peace-loving states, to do just that. Above all, Costa Rica appeals for an end to this invasion. We call for an immediate ceasefire. We call for the swift withdrawal of troops and armed groups from Ukraine. And we call for all military actions against Ukraine to cease. If violence would only be put aside, we could return to peace and diplomacy. Mr. President, Costa Rica will vote in favor of this resolution. We will do so because we must reject a vision of the world whereby force is used to achieve foreign policy goals. We reject a vision of a world in which arms are prioritized along with violence. While lives of people and the very life of the earth is lost, it is vital to put an end to this aggression and invasion. But we must also put an end to the mentality that has brought us to this point. We cannot allow an attitude to develop whereby, in the face of attacks against the core principles of the United Nations Charter, the international community does nothing. We will vote in favor of this resolution to demonstrate unity and commitment to the core principles of international law, to demonstrate our commitment to peace and collective action, and to demonstrate that states can redraw a map of the world and that we can reshape history. We will vote in favor of the principles of the Charter now and in the future, and we will vote for the protection of Ukraine's sovereignty, for the protection of its territorial integrity, and for the protection of its citizens. Costa Rica unites with this front against the violation of the UN Charter, against the transgression and violation of various freedom. We unite against war, violence, and the violation of the territorial integrity of any UN member state. Let us vote so that the draft resolution that is being proposed and that is being co-sponsored by a growing majority of this resolution can be passed. Let us all unite. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Costa Rica. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Thank you. Mr. President, Secretary General, Greece allies to the statement delivered by the EU and wish to add the following in its national capacity. I will repeat what has been said time and again in this chamber. The UN Charter is clear. All states must refrain from threat or use of force. This is the guiding principle underpinning the UN Charter and all states should abide to it. Greece strongly and unequivocally condemns Russia's unprovoked attack against Ukraine. Greece remains steadfast in her staunch support to the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. This attack is challenging fundamental concepts of international law, the inviolability of borders and the very right of sovereign states to choose their own orientation. Respect of international sovereignty, integrity, and independence of all countries are fundamental principles of international law and the main pillars of Greek foreign policy. Violations of international law, no matter who they target, are threats to us all. This is why we can make no exceptions and must maintain a consistent stance across the board. Russia's aggressive military action constitutes a serious threat to the established rules-based international order. As such, it demands a unified response worthy of its magnitude. Revisionism is the main threat to world peace and will not be tolerated, no matter where it comes from. We are particularly alarmed by Russia's raising of the nuclear alert level. We cannot stand idle as the spectrum of nuclear destruction is looming. We call on Russia to de-escalate and to return to the previous alert level. We stand by the side of the Ukrainian people who are currently being faced with this tragic turn of events and are courageously fighting an unprovoked and unjustified military aggression by Russia. We are already counting a tragic toll of innocent victims, among which Greeks, injured people, internally displaced people, and refugees. Mr. President, these deaths are unnecessary. This suffering is unnecessary. This attack is unnecessary. Attacks against all civilians in Ukraine must stop immediately. International humanitarian law is seriously challenged. Protecting and meeting the urgent needs of innocent civilians is of utmost importance. A centuries-long established Greek community of around 100,000 in Ukraine, concentrated mainly in the area of Mariupol, is already mourning victims. The brutal Russian attack against civilians in Sartana and Bugas towns near Mariupol resulted to the death of 10 members of the Greek community and left many injured, including children. Our consular authorities in Mariupol and Odessa remain operating in support of people in need. We strive to save lives. Greece, as an active member of the international community from the very beginning of this crisis, has mobilized in coordination with its partners and allies in order to project a unified and effective response. Our reactions and declarations condemning the Russian attack were loud and straightforward. The adoption of unprecedented sanctions which will hit the Russian economy in the substantial way has been swift. At the same time, Together with our partners, we remain committed to address the grave humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in front of our eyes. There is no doubt that we are at the beginning of a new era and that the geopolitical turmoil that will ensue will have major consequences. But the price of freedom for which we must fight is very high. This Assembly has a historic responsibility to address the current attack. This is the only way to save the international rules-based order, to save the principles that unite us all in this room, the UN Charter, to stand for the cause of peace. Greece counts 201 years of independence, and in the struggle for freedom, our country has always been on the right side of history. We will continue in this direction. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Greece. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President,
señor Secretario General,
Secretary General,
Excellencias,
Excellencies,
en la noche
in the evening of the 23rd of February, 2022,
presente en la sala
sitting
del
in the Security Council chamber, the Security Council being the primary organ of the United Nations that has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, Ecuador learnt with surprise and disappointment the news that military operations were beginning. The invasion of Ukraine was beginning, and that was a violation of the most fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter. Our disappointment was due to the fact that, as I stated before this plenary on the 23rd of February, when we were dealing with the agenda item on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, as I said then, I found value in all of these statements made before Security Council meetings held on the 31st of January, the 17th of February, and the 21st of February. And these last two sessions were held under the Russian presidency. My surprise in the chamber was a consequence of that disappointment, because we couldn't imagine that what we'd seen is a flagrant rejection of the commitments that all member states of this organization undertook to peacefully solve disputes, and to solve disputes using peaceful means alone. My country has demonstrated that it is a peace-loving state, and for decades has issued statements similar to those that I'm making before you today, because peace is a part of our foreign policy, our conviction as a state, and we are fundamentally committed to international law and the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, and we believe that these are the only viable path towards peace, security, and development for all peoples of the world. Consequently, I reiterate that historically it has been seen that the principles that inform all peace negotiations must leave the door open so that all those involved feel encouraged to resume the path of international law and feel encouraged to produce authentic peace. To produce that authentic peace, you can't simply look at the present, you have to look at what inevitable future consequences of any action might be. This emergency special session of the General Assembly must serve as a precedent so that the reprehensible circumstances bringing us together here today do not reoccur, and must serve as a precedent so that if such incidents do reoccur, they are considered with the same seriousness by the international community and the General Assembly. I also wish to point to the humanitarian aspects of this conflict. War is essentially bad because it causes suffering for people and claims human life. Consequently, a widespread outrage has been seen and a widespread appeal has been launched for an immediate cessation of hostilities, because with every day that passes we are witnessing more horrific news. Ecuador has been unequivocal in its statements because we separate those who, with their conduct that violates international law, we separate between those people whose conduct violates international law and those seeking to solve disputes. We support the initiative that France and Mexico have submitted to the Security Council in the humanitarian field, and we also support what the Secretary General has done, as well as what UNHCR has done, along with the IOM, the International Red Cross, and other organizations. We support all of these initiatives because they may avoid the worsening of an already catastrophic situation which is affecting citizens of many nationalities. As far as Ecuador is concerned, we have launched an emergency plan which seeks to ensure the security and personal protection of Ecuadorian citizens. With international support, this plan has allowed us to remove from Ukraine students in particular, and we've allowed them to return to their countries, including Poland, Slovenia, and other countries. And I thank the international community for its support here. I would conclude by recalling the basic premise inscribed on a plate that's on one of the walls outside this General Assembly room. And this premise states that in the life of relations between nations, respect for the rights of others means peace. With that in mind, I call upon all members to support the draft resolution which has been submitted for the consideration of this Assembly. Ecuador is one of the initial co-sponsors of this Uniting for Peace resolution. Mexico will not hesitate to vote in favor of this resolution because of its respect for international law and because of its respect for the principles which underpin the United Nations and the principles which consequently underpin peace, peace being a vital prerequisite for the security and development of humankind. Many thanks indeed for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ecuador. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President.
Señor Secretario General.
Mr. Secretary General.
Excelencias.
Excellencies. The international system which governs relations between states and peoples is underpinned by two principles, which, at the same time, are imperative commitments. The first of these is the obligation not to attack. In other words, the obligation not to use force or to threaten to use force against the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of another state. The second of these principles is the obligation to resolve disputes through peaceful means as provided for in international law. When these peremptory norms of international law are violated, peace is gravely violated as the result of an act of aggression. This is the situation in Ukraine, caused by the illegitimate use of force by the Russian Federation. This indeed is a use of force which does not only violate the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, but is a use of force whose grave consequence has been to replace a state of peace between two countries, even though there were clear tensions, replace that state of peace with a state of war. And this runs counter to the United Nations Charter and international law. Once again, Peru expresses in the strongest terms its condemnation for this act of aggression. Peruvian diplomacy has, since the country became an independent state in 1821, built its external relations upon the principles of non-intervention in the domestic affairs of others and on the peaceful resolution of disputes. These are basic standards of American international law. And we have contributed to the gradual development of that law with our own conduct on the international stage. Our unequivocal condemnation of the aggression against Ukraine and our call for an urgent peaceful solution to the conflict is fully coherent with our own history. Equally coherent with our own history is our urgent appeal for the immediate, unfettered and permanent respect for international humanitarian law, in accordance with the provisions of the Geneva Conventions of 1949, conventions which protect non-combatants as well as civilian property and civilians. It is vital to protect the space we have for neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian action. Peru endorses the appeal issued by the International Red Cross to urgently tackle the situation of refugees and internally displaced persons. And we echo their appeal for the urgent adoption of measures to protect infrastructure, such as water, gas, and electricity systems which meet the basic needs of civilians. This emergency special session of the General Assembly will adopt decisions. It will adopt historic decisions. It will adopt urgent decisions. And to use a somewhat verbose Spanish phrase, it will adopt decisive decisions, decisiones decisivas. The existence alone of conflict indicates to us that there are tasks we must confront immediately. These tasks are an immediate ceasefire, the withdrawal of interventionist military forces, the protection of and the provision of assistance to the civilian population, and the peaceful and negotiated solution of the conflict. We support the efforts of the Secretary General to forge ahead along this path. The draft resolution on which this emergency special session will vote seeks to achieve these goals. Peru co-sponsors this resolution and supports it, and we do so with the firm belief that the peaceful and diplomatic solution of crisis is the path that ethics and law call upon us to follow. We note with hope that today has seen the beginning of meetings between the parties to the conflict. We ardently hope that vital initial agreements can be reached, such as a ceasefire. The United Nations Charter has as its core premise the idea that all states have the right to ensure that their existence in peace and security be protected, and that they have the right to be protected, but that right comes with the obligation to respect these same rights in other states. This inextricably linked nature of rights and obligations where peace and security are concerned is something we must remember, because it is the very core of our collective security system. The lasting solution to the conflict, which now dates back to 2014, must be based on the application of this principle and must seek to meet the legitimate aspirations of peace and security harbored by all parties. Allow me, Mr. President, to bring to the Assembly one of the core beliefs of Javier Pérez de Cuellar, who I think can be of guidance to us at the current time. He said that the seeds of war must be eradicated across the globe. He said that the post-Cold War global order can only be grounded in peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
The distinguished representative of Peru. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guatemala.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, Guatemala is a co-sponsor of the draft resolution Aggression Against Ukraine because, as a founding member of the United Nations organization, we firmly believe in the principles and values of the Charter which founded it. This Charter contains the pillars and purposes that are crucial and the pillars and purposes that led to the inception of the United Nations. These are all pillars and purposes that, as states that signed the Charter, we committed to defending. My country would recall that this organization was created 76 years ago to protect future generations from the scourge of war. It was created so that the unspeakable suffering to which humankind was subjected in the First and Second World Wars never again recurred. Consequently, the maintenance of international peace and security is the most important pillar of our work. We must fully respect the fundamental rights of all human beings, prioritizing the life and value of every human person. It is clear that we are obliged to refrain from the use of force or the threat of use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any other state. And it is clear that this applies to all states without exception. Mr. President, as a country, we shoulder the responsibility before several multilateral fora to support regional and global efforts designed to defend peace. Guatemala condemns in the strongest possible terms the military aggression and the unjustified invasion by the armed forces of the Russian Federation against the territorial integrity and the people of Ukraine. We condemn the flagrant violation by Russia of the United Nations Charter, of international law, and of international human rights law. We condemn the military decisions and actions of the Russian Federation, decisions and actions which have caused the senseless loss of human lives. The lives that have been lost include those of men, women, and children, and other people have been seriously injured. All are victims of this unjustifiable act which continues to threaten the region, just as it does global stability and security. My country stands in solidarity with the government of Ukraine, and particularly with its people. We call for collective actions and diplomatic endeavors such that the Russian Federation immediately ceases all aggression and all use of force against Ukraine and against any other state. We also call for the immediate withdrawal from illegally occupied territories so that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of this country is respected fully. We echo the diplomatic appeal issued to the Russian Federation to uphold its obligations as a member of the United Nations and a permanent member of the Security Council, because it has a responsibility to maintain international peace and security. Mr. President, it is of grave concern that the military operations of the Russian Federation have seen the launch of various types of missiles to the detriment of civilians. These actions have frequently violated international humanitarian law, and we've also heard that cluster munitions have been used. These have been internationally banned in light of the indiscriminate effects that they have. Guatemala firmly believes that these attacks are disproportionate and run counter to the basic norms which apply to all wars or conflicts. My delegation calls upon the Russian Federation not to continue with its military aggression and to halt this war. It must do so to avoid a situation whereby this brutal conflict has an impact on security in the rest of Europe and in the international community. Moreover, Guatemala expresses its grave concern at the news that the Chernobyl nuclear plant has been taken by Russian armed forces, and in light of that news, we recall that any attack or threat of an attack against nuclear facilities dedicated for the peaceful use of nuclear energy is a violation of the principles of the United Nations Charter, a violation of international law, and the statute of the IAEA. Moreover, Guatemala, in line with its position of principle, expresses its concern at the statements made by the Russian Federation and at the possible use of nuclear weapons. Guatemala staunchly believes that we still have time to return to the negotiating table, to diplomatic dialogue, and that we still have time to end the conflict. We cannot allow ourselves to repeat history. Guatemala is speaking out before this assembly in favor of life, in favor of peace, and in favor of global security, with the firm commitment to leaving a better world for future generations behind us. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Guatemala. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Albania.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, last Friday, Albania and the United States of America submitted to the Security Council a draft resolution on the act of aggression Russia has committed and is committing against Ukraine. This act is in clear and blatant violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter of the United Nations, the obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of any state. 11 members of the Security Council voted yes. 1 country voted no, the aggressor. 81 states co-sponsored it, cross-regionally. We thank all those states for their support and for standing up to defend the values and principles and norms that make us friends, not enemies, that make us embrace peace, not aggression. We are here in the General Assembly today to continue our efforts and rally the world to condemn aggression and hold the perpetrator accountable. Dear colleagues, we stand in admiration before the courage of Ukrainians, men and women, defending their country, which, with whatever they have, in a war that they did not choose. They are in their right, and they will prevail, since they know that never in history did Russian tanks win when they were not welcome. This time will be no exception. The Soviet Union is dead, and nothing, no fantasy, no nostalgia, no war will ever bring it back. We condemn the involvement of Belarus in this aggression against Ukraine and call on it to abide by its international obligations. As the Albanian Minister for Foreign Affairs stated yesterday, this war is more than just a war for the freedom of Ukraine. It is a struggle for the future of a democratic Europe, for the architecture of security and cooperation in our continent, as well as rules-based international order. Therefore, it concerns us all. Dear colleagues, Russia has been warned. If you go to war, you'll face severe and massive consequences, and it's happening. Albania has joined the concert of nations that has imposed sanctions and other restrictive measures against Russia. We have subscribed to the entire package adopted by the EU. We have closed our airspace to Russian operators, have joined the individual sanctions on the freezing of assets of individuals up to the Russian president, which will apply to 654 individuals and 52 entities. Economic sanctions include restrictive measures in finance, energy, transport, and technology. Albania will no longer participate in any sport activity facing with the Russian Federation until Russia ceases its aggression against Ukraine. Also, given the worsening humanitarian situation, we have committed to shelter refugees. Dear colleagues, if we agree, willingly or by indifference, to let what is commonly agreed unravel in front of our eyes as this act of aggression does, what respect do we have for what we have been building during 76 years since the World War II? What hopes do we cherish that we can continue to defend our rights individually and collectively? What assurance there is that we will not be condemned to be just a nameplate or just a dry number in this room? Instead, if we think and maintain that despite size, might, or wealth, we are equal members and responsible actors of this assembly of nations, truly committed to uphold norms and values of our civilization, working for peace, harmony, and cooperation, we need to show it. Albania has co-sponsored the draft resolution, and we call on all the members to do so. Russia must immediately stop its military actions, withdraw all forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine, and respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence with its internationally recognized border. And I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Albania. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
إن ما يثير التساؤل بشأن عقد هذه الدورة اليوم أنه على الرغم من الأزمات
What's curious about today's session is that despite successive crises and major challenges that the international community has been facing for decades, and where the Security Council has failed to take on its responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, Western states have never demonstrated so much excitement in calling an emergency special session of the General Assembly. This shows a politics of hypocrisy, of double standards, as well as one based on interests and not principles. The memories and the files of the United Nations have ample proof of the many examples of illegitimate Western intervention and acts of aggression of the United States of America and their allies in NATO that have caused millions of innocent deaths in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Not to mention the blockades that have been imposed on a number of peoples in Latin America and elsewhere to achieve their objectives. We haven't seen much enthusiasm for a session such as today's back then, far from it, quite the contrary. My delegation believes that this historic emergency session on the situation in Ukraine completes the anti-Russian campaign that finds its origins in the provocative and hostile rhetoric towards Russia propagated by the West to stoke tensions in Ukraine and to thereby compromise the security and territorial integrity of Russia. Mr. President, the Syrian Arab Republic underscores the importance of resolving regional disputes and international ones through dialogue and diplomacy, and supporting the efforts to maintain security and stability around the world. We respect the principles of the United Nations Charter. The Syrian Arab Republic condemns the campaign organized and led by the West and their media against the Russian Federation. In particular, the deliberate spreading of fake news, of insidious allegations, as well as photos and videos that have been doctored, all of this to prevent Russia from exercising its natural right to defend its sovereignty and its security, as well as to protect its people in line with the UN Charter. Some Western countries have gone as far as closing down Russian media. They have banned them to prevent the public in Europe from finding out what's happening. Since the coup in 2014, Western countries have ignored the historic links between the Ukrainian and Russian peoples. They have also ignored the suffering of the inhabitants of the Donbas region, the suffering that has lasted many years. These states deemed it more important to give NATO a zone of influence at the gates of Russia, leading to suffering in Donetsk and Lugansk. When Russia launched a special operation to protect the people there, these same states began a campaign based on the UN Charter and what it qualifies as humanitarian suffering in Ukraine, setting aside the deep-rooted causes of the crisis that they themselves are responsible for. It is a paroxysm of political hypocrisy. Mr. President, the escalation of the situation between Russia and Ukraine comes from Western states not respecting their commitments towards Russia, and that's been going on for decades. These states have ignored the legitimate security concerns of Russia and have not hesitated to provide weapons and missiles to Ukraine, showing tireless generosity and downplaying the effects of their decisions on regional security and stability. Nonetheless, the Russian Federation has always made pragmatic proposals and has demonstrated restraint in the face of American and European attempts, as well as those of NATO, to exacerbate the situation. These proposals, though, have been ignored, and Russia's security concerns have not been taken seriously. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, this is what the United States and the West are resorting to once again: coercive measures, unilateral coercive measures, in contravention of international law and the UN Charter. These measures are simply fanning the flames and harming the people in the region. My country condemns the punitive measures and believes that being on the right side of history means rejecting the West's bellicose policies in order rather to preserve the interests of the peoples who oppose them and opposes their interventionism. Thank you.
Representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Mr. President, India is deeply concerned that the situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate. We reiterate our call for immediate cessation of violence and an end to hostilities. All member states of the United Nations are not only obliged to follow the UN Charter, but also respect international law and territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. Peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with these principles has been India's consistent position that has stood the test of time. As such, my government firmly believes that there is no other choice but to return to the path of diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi has advocated this strongly in his recent conversations with the leadership of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. In this regard, we welcome the commencement of direct talks between both sides. We reiterate our firm conviction that all differences and interests can only be bridged through honest, sincere, and sustained dialogue. There is an urgent and pressing humanitarian situation developing in Ukraine. The international community needs to ensure free and uninterrupted humanitarian access and smooth movement of all peoples. Keeping in view the humanitarian requirements in Ukraine, my government has also decided to provide urgent relief supplies, including medicines. These are expected to be delivered soon. India is doing whatever it can to undertake immediate and urgent evacuation efforts of Indian nationals who are still stranded in Ukraine. The safety and security of Indian nationals, including a large number of students, remains our top priority. The complex and uncertain situation at the border crossings is adversely impacting the uninterrupted and predictable movement of people. This important humanitarian necessity must be immediately addressed. In this regard, I would like to thank all neighboring countries of Ukraine who have opened their borders for our citizens and given all facilities to our missions and their personnel to evacuate Indian nationals to their homeland. We stand ready to help those from our neighbors and developing countries who are also stranded in Ukraine and may seek assistance. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of India.
Chile is the most.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Chile follows other speakers speaking at this historic session. During this historic session, the General Assembly will have to take action to guarantee international peace and security. The very fact that this is the first time in decades that the Assembly is meeting in this format bears witness to the exceptional nature of the situation and to the frustration of the international community at the paralysis of the Security Council and its failure to adopt a decision in favor of peace, a decision required by the current situation in Ukraine. As Chile indicated in the meeting of this Assembly on the 23rd of February, my country, in its international relations, adheres to the principles enshrined in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. As such, we unequivocally reject the use of force or the threat of use of force in international relations. Disputes between states must be resolved by exclusively peaceful means, in accordance with the letter and spirit of the United Nations Charter. Mr. President, Chile will support and also co-sponsors the resolution which is submitted in this special session of the General Assembly, a resolution which condemns the aggression against Ukraine. We urge for the immediate cessation of this aggression. We call urgently for the withdrawal of occupying troops, the protection of civilians, and for access to humanitarian aid. We call for the respect of the full territorial integrity of Ukraine, and we call for the recognition of the independence of the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk to be left without any effect whatsoever. In light of the above, Chile also co-sponsored the resolution which was presented last Friday before the Security Council. At the same time, I underscore that our national position on this situation has been publicly expressed by the highest authorities of my country and in the government's official communiques. Moreover, we are encouraged to learn of the beginning of direct discussions between the parties with a view to putting an end to the occupation in Ukraine. The international community, through this General Assembly, is observing these discussions and is ready to support them with its efforts to ensure that international law and peace prevail. Mr. President, we are still living with the pandemic, and we are seeing an increase of poverty and precarity in so many regions of the world. And we also are facing the challenge of climate change. In light of the above, we need unity now more than ever before, and we need this organization now more than ever before to uphold its obligations. We need to champion our effective cooperation so we can achieve a better present and a dignified future for future generations. I conclude my statement, Mr. President, by recalling the preamble of the United Nations Charter. It states, "We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war." And it continues, "Consequently, we will ensure by the acceptance of principles that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest." Many thanks, Mr. President and Mr. Secretary General.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chile. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers tomorrow morning, 1st March, in this hall at 10 a.m. The meeting is adjourned.